Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Hendriks Experience Podcast. Again, today we have the privilege of having with us Andre Lozano from Lozano Law. Welcome back, Andre.
Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about situations that maybe aren't so pleasant in real estate. You know, a lot of times we're having a lot of fun. You're buying, you're selling. Everybody's having a great time. It's really exciting. And then I remember a while back, we did have a conversation about wills and estate sales and things like that. So maybe not such a happy time in that situation. And there is one other type that does come up, and that's when we have a relational breakdown. So can you speak a little bit to that, Andre?
So sometimes we see a lot of people who are common law spouses and married spouses. You have situations where common law spouses are not on title. You just have one spouse and not the other, and then dividing property at that point complicates itself. And then married spouses, you could have two people on title or just one on title, right, and all that stuff.
Well, let's just jump into the distinct difference between a common law relationship and an actual married couple. Because there is a distinct difference in Family Law Act, correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Yes. So when you have a situation that's common law and one person is on title to the property and the other one is not, is there any distinction in law in what happens in that situation that you can share with everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see this all the time. Usually you have two parties who are together for like 10 years, common law, and they think they're a married couple because they treat each other like a spouse.
Yeah.
But, sorry, you were going to...
No, I was just going to say it's like being married to them, and in their eyes, they're married.
Exactly.
Right? So, but the law does not follow that.
That's right.
That thought, correct?
It's been challenged several times in the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada says, no, if you're common law spouses, you clearly don't have intention to participate or share in the property, so you're not entitled to property. That doesn't mean that you can make an argument for property on a joint family venture, which is another complicated thing. But in essence, you're not entitled to property.
Entitled by law.
By law, exactly.
So you're also, besides being a real estate lawyer, you're also a family law lawyer.
Yeah.
Correct? So you're running into this situation in multiple ways.
Yes.
So when it comes to the family law aspect of it, and how do you see that play out when there's a home owned? It's outside of the Family Law Act. How do you do you have any situations that you've run into where there's, it's a challenge. It's a little bit of a problem there. And it can sometimes get a little tenuous, I would say.
Yes, and it gets more tenuous when you have the common law spouses because they are under the impression that they're entitled to something. So it's trying to explain that they're not, and that we would have to make other costly arguments to maybe get them closer to having a property claim.
What do you mean by costly arguments?
So because it takes time to look at finances, it takes time to look at contributions for the past, assuming, let's say, 5 years or whatever that relationship was. We're looking at joint accounts, joint liabilities. We're trying to see whether or not the parties actually intended to live like a joint family venture and contributions to the property and all that stuff.
And again, so if there's a common law spouses and one person's not on title, yet they've been making all the mortgage payments, utilities, maintenance and such, and they happen to be one that's not on title, what happens in that situation? What have you seen?
There are some things that could fall under like resulting trusts, constructive trusts kind of deal. And because those arguments are not really legislated, they're more judge-made law, it takes a lot of time to do the legwork of reading all those cases and all that stuff.
Legwork is for you as a lawyer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
That's why it gets expensive, because you have to do a lot of up-to-date.
And you're referring to case law.
That's right.
So basically, your story that you're creating or created with this common law spouse, you're looking for other similar stories that have happened in the past with other couples and to see how that judge responded to that situation. And that's what creates case law, correct?
That's exactly That's exactly what it is.
Maybe I
You
should
nailed
be a
it.
lawyer.
Yeah, you should totally be a lawyer.
Darn, well, if the market ever turns really, really bad, maybe I switch gears.
Yeah. You're more than welcome to come join me, Jerry.
Maybe it could be my next career. But in the meantime, I love what I do, so we're good. So what have you found in case law? Can you put a generality to it, or is it very specific case by case on that regard?
It is very specific case by case, so it's kind of hard to generalize that. That pretty much.
So what you're saying is sometimes it works out. Well, it's always generally working out for somebody.
Yes.
And do you find in cases, in ones that you've experienced, does it usually the judge make it pretty balanced, or is there usually someone who feels they really got slighted in the deal?
This is an area.
This is real life, right?
This
we don't relish in speaking of relationships that have gone sideways, but it's the reality of life is that this happens a lot.
It does happen a lot, and while I can't really comment on a judge's opinion,
I was going to say you can't name names, of course. But
I can't really, speak to whether or not the justice system is fair or not. What I can say,
you can say. You can tell us how you feel.
What I can say is that there are rules, and they're legislated, and there's also rules created in case law, as you mentioned before. Judge-made law essentially. Judges should prioritize what is legislated and created by other judges.
So you're saying what they should do is follow case law. Let that be their guide.
And
they
law.
generally are by case law and by the actual law.
Generally, yes.
Statutes.
Yeah, they do that. But there's other elements too that throw curveballs to situations, because there's this concept called discretion, right? So judges do have discretion. And while sometimes lawyers might not necessarily feel that something might really be legal, or maybe legal in the sense of following case law to a T, it's generally because a judge is employing their discretion to try to make the most equitable and the most just outcome in that situation.
So let's say that the judge doesn't exactly follow case law.
Sure.
They have to at least follow exactly statute law, but they have discretion.
Yes.
And if one party in the couple says, I don't really like how the judge used their discretion,
Right.
How would a person be able to appeal that decision then?
Absolutely.
And have you had any situations like that?
Yes, we've had some situations like that. And what's complicated is that if you're going to appeal something, you either have to appeal it on issues of fact or law. So either the judge made a mistake in the interpretation of law, or the judge made a mistake in interpreting fact, which later resulted in a legal outcome.
So if they relied on a fact but added their own discretion, that would be okay. And it would be hard to argue that. Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily that it would be harder to argue, but let's just say that maybe they interpreted the fact wrong, and because they interpreted the fact wrong, they chose to interpret it law wrong. Does that make sense? So
it's a little bit confusing.
Yeah. So in a sense, if they interpreted a fact wrong, it leads to one outcome. And if you believe that the fact should have been considered a little bit differently.
So the fact was not the fact.
Exactly.
And that's the fact.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And that's the fact.
Great. So I'm glad we got that straightened out. So, and this rolls into, generally the biggest asset, unless maybe they have a business, an ongoing concern that generates a sizable revenue. And sometimes pensions come into play as well. Other than that, real estate would be the biggest factor generally in a separation of assets. Did you call it separation of assets? How would you?
Yeah, you can call it that. Separation of assets, sure.
So that would generally be the biggest factor, correct?
Yeah, real estate typically is. There's other situations, unfortunately, where I've had to deal with situations where you have an older couple, or like even in their 60s, 70s, and what have you, and they're divorcing after 25, 35 years of marriage, and that's usually their biggest asset because it doesn't have much of a mortgage.
Right.
So at that point, it's, obviously calling you guys up, real estate agents, and
and that's where we come into play.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
we often get the phone call Many times I've dealt with marital breakdown situations, whether common law or actual married couples. Yeah. And generally, we always hope that they're getting along fine. Sometimes we find they're still living in the home together and getting along better in that situation than when they were actually living as a couple, so to speak, right? Surprisingly, yes. And it's always easier when it's a mutual decision. And honestly, this is real life happening. And sometimes one person, it sides more with one person than another who has the desire to end the relationship. So it can be very tenuous. And we have to handle that very kid gloves, so to speak, and be very empathetic to the situation. And, just pause and take your time as we work through this process with them. And we just generally want to lay out the steps and how we're going to help them get to the end of the process. Because just like selling any home or buying any home, they're at point A and they're trying to get to point B. Their point B, unfortunately, is a situation where they're no longer going to be apart. And sometimes we're helping one of them purchase a home, sometimes both purchase a home, sometimes rent a home, right? So a lot of different situations in that regard. So you're on the other end, you're at the back end once the deal is actually sold firm. Have you ever had any challenging situations at the point where it's actually sold and then you have some challenges with closing?
Not generally, and that's kind of what you want to see. You don't really want to come to having problems on a real estate deal just because there's so many other options either a seller or a buyer might have in civil suits, like civil litigation and all that stuff. But there's been the odd one or two that, between lawyers we're able to negotiate something and come to a resolution that it's, pleasing to both parties and, just resolve it that way. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes we've sold the home and if we've done our job at our end, there should be a pretty smooth sailing through the process. Yeah. And if we sense there's anything off, we might recommend that they speak with their lawyer or you and try to resolve these issues before we hit the market. Some things can come up later. But a while back, we had a situation where the one spouse was absent, right? So maybe share with people how that kind of worked itself through.
So I believe this is one where you have a party who is wanting to sell the home, but then the spouse is maybe taking his time to consent to the sale of the home. So typically, under ordinary circumstances, you might want to go to court so that the judge might dispense with consent or the need for consent because somebody is just not wanting to sell the home, even though that's in the best interest of both parties.
Right, and to clarify that.
Yeah, sorry.
Basically, don't be sorry. It's all good. But basically, one person says, I want to sell, and the other person makes it very difficult.
Exactly.
And so the spouse that wants to move forward, they can make application to the court in order to get a court order. So we call that a court-ordered sale. And the judge will make determination of may put in certain parameters about the sale of the property, correct?
That's right. It's a little bit difficult because in the process, it's called like an interim order. It's very difficult to get a final order during the process of litigation. So usually those issues are dealt with at trial, unless both parties consent, and if not, then you file, your motion and deal with it there. But I think the end goal is to dispense with consent. So then that way you can go ahead with a judge order to sell the property and get what you need. So.
I did have it happen a number of years ago. Had a situation. I didn't know this couple at all. But for whatever reason, the court required them to list their home with myself and directed that they couldn't have any say in the pricing of the property. So, of course, we're going to list it at fair market value. But I guess the issues were so contentious between the two of them that they were never going to agree. So the court said, then we'll let a professional realtor make that decision. And so it all worked out great. I set the price, fair price, and we got a great solid offer, and the parties were able to move forward. And sometimes, although the courts don't really, it seems, would want to set those parameters, it's actually good for both parties at the end of the day. Would you agree?
Yes, exactly. I think what you described is quite fair from a judge's perspective. They want to make sure that the outcome is balanced, and the objective is arrived at in a way that it's not going to be favorable to one side over the other kind of deal. So
Absolutely. So the bottom line is it's a challenging time. We're here to help them through the process and help them get to the other side so that they can move forward in their lives.
And I have to say, your firm, your brokerage does a great job of ensuring that process. I've dealt with other brokerages, and they forget little things, particularly requisition dates and all these other things are very important from a legal side point of view. But your brokerage, I haven't had a problem since we started.
I guess that's when a little being bill extra picky comes is beneficial to everybody.
Exactly.
Because you want to make sure that transaction completes. So again, as I mentioned, that people can move on in their lives.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll catch you next time on the Hendriks Experience Podcast. Cheers.